Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 38, which focuses on the musculoskeletal system, so muscles and skeletons. And before we get into our own systems, we always like to first focus on some other organisms. So there are many different types of skeletal systems, not just the kind that you find in us. So the first type I want to mention is the hydrostatic skeleton. Now, this skeleton is interesting because for its structure, it actually lacks a hard skeleton that you think of when you think of humans. Instead, what these organisms have is a fluid-filled cavity. That's why it's hydrostatic. Whenever you see hydro, think liquid, water. So they have a fluid-filled cavity that's called either a gastrovascular or a column. Okay, so column, which I'm looking on my slide, I forgot to, oh, there. When you see coel, that's relating to column. So this fluid-filled cavity for the hydrostatic skeleton, the function of this system is just like with our skeletal system, it supports the body form of this organism. And it provides resistance for the contraction of muscles, basically to act against this skeletal system, just like yours does as well. And we'll cover that in later slides. But basically, the functions of the skeletal system is not just to support the body form, but also to help with mobility by helping with the resistance of those muscle contractions. The last thing that this does, being a hydrostatic skeleton, is it provides internal organs with protection. And it's funny because, you know, seeing fluid would, you would think protection, shock absorption for organs, but our hard skeleton also provides protection from internal organs. So whenever you're thinking of the functions of any skeleton, they'll usually be very similar to each other, supporting body function, helping with movement, and protecting internal organs. And when you think of the hydrostatic skeleton, basically this is a very flexible skeleton because it's supported by fluid pressure, by having that fluid-filled cavity surrounded by muscles for flexibility and movement. Now, when you think of examples, think of organisms such as the earthworm that I have on this slide, as well as creatures such as millipedes and jellyfish, starfish, sea anemones. All of those use hydrostatic skeletons. So that's earthworms, millipedes, jellyfish, starfish, and sea anemones. Then we get into the skeletons that you're most likely more familiar with. There are exoskeletons versus endoskeletons, and you might want to circle star highlight endoskeletons because that is what we have. So the difference between them, whenever you see the word exo means outside, whereas endo means within. So any organism who has an exoskeleton has an external skeleton. It's on the outside of their body. You find this with creatures such as mollusks and arthropods. So any of those crispy, crunchy insects that you encounter outside, they all have exoskeletons. Now, the benefit of having an external skeleton is it provides their body protection from environmental factors. But the downside with this kind of external skeleton is they can't just freely grow, right? Because they have this hard shell around them. So what do they have to do? They have to molt in order to grow. So that's the downside for them. They constantly have to shed their exoskeleton in order to grow and then reform it. The reason why it's so crunchy, as I say, you hear that crunch sound if you accidentally step on an organism with an exoskeleton, is because a lot of times it's made of chitin, which we mentioned is that hard carbohydrate that you find in shells such as crabs. And it's also a jointed skeleton, which is important for the movement of these organisms. Now, instead of an exoskeleton, we have an endoskeleton, which means that our skeleton is on the inside. Okay, so you shouldn't see your skeleton, and if you do, that's a problem. You should go to a doctor for that. Now, with endoskeletons, in addition to us, any other vertebrates have endoskeletons, as well as things called echinoderms, so creatures such as starfish. And basically what an endoskeleton is it's made up of mineralized bones, so nice hard bones, and cartilage. Okay, and we'll talk about that in later slides. Now, the benefit of having an endoskeleton, well, if you think of the downside of the exoskeleton, then our benefit is the opposite. So our benefit is that our skeleton grows as we grow. Okay, so any endoskeletons grow as the animal grows. That's very good because it means it supports more weight, so you could get to bigger sizes, and it doesn't limit the space for internal organs because it's inside your body, okay? And it's constantly growing. Now, when we talk about our endoskeleton, there's certain things I want you to know. First of all, the main functions of our skeleton. And some of them will match up with what we were already saying about exoskeletons, but there'll be a couple more things as well. So first of all, our skeleton supports the body and protects vital organs. So if you think about it, for instance, your vital organ of your brain is protected by your skeleton by the skull. Or if you think about your vital organs of your heart, your lungs, they're protected by the bones, the skeleton of your rib cage. So very important to have a skeleton for support and protection. Your skeleton also permits your movement, and it provides sites for muscles to attach to further help you move. Additionally, what we haven't mentioned yet is that our skeleton serves as a storage site. So it's a storage site for important things such as minerals and lipids, especially calcium and phosphate ions. And you're going to hear calcium come up a lot whenever we talk about bones and the skeleton. The last thing I want to mention in terms of the functions of our skeleton is that it produces blood cells. And as you know, blood cells are very, very important to your body. Now, the place that you will associate with the production of these blood cells in bones is the red bone marrow. So when you hear bone marrow, think production of blood cells. And again, we're going to go into more details in the coming slides. Now, when we talk about bone and bone tissue, it's made up of a bunch of different cells. First of all, I want to point out that whenever you see this weird looking word, osseous, that means bone. That's the scientific fancy way of saying bone. And in the bone, which is a type of connective tissue, there's a whole bunch of different cells. And I want you to know what each term means. So first you have the osteocytes, and these are your mature bone cells. You also have osteoblasts, and I want you to circle the B of osteoblasts and think build, because osteoblasts, they synthesize new bone matrix. They are bone-forming cells. So osteoblasts build bone, okay? The opposite of that are the osteoclasts, and for that one, you can circle Cl in clasts, because Cl will remind you clean up, because osteoclasts are responsible for dissolving, for breaking down the bone matrix and removing any worn out bone cells. They work with osteoblasts to help heal or renew bones, because think about it, you can't just build bones with osteoblasts. You would have these massive collection of bone cells. You need to clean up the old worn out ones first. So you have the two of these osteoblasts and clasts working together to help renew your bones, one cleaning up, one building. You also have very important cells, the osteoprogenitor cells, and these are basically stem cells that differentiate into the osteoblasts. Okay, so osteoprogenitor cells become bone cells. They become the osteoblasts to help renew bones. Now, when you think of your bones, once you know the cells, you have to know the actual structure. When you see a bone, that long bone, we call it the shank. So let me just highlight all of that. That long area is the shank of the bone. When you think of bone, there are two types of bone. There's the compact bone and there are the spongy bone parts of your bones or your skeleton. Compact bone is also called cortical bone. And basically your compact bone is the hard external layer of all of your bones. It surrounds what we call the medullary cavity, which you also sometimes hear as bone marrow. So your compact bone is the hard outer shell of your bones, okay? And it's made up of the structural bone unit called osteons. So I highlight that with my laser, osteons. And these osteons are basically concentric circles around blood vessels and nerves. So when you see all of these concentric circles, meaning lined up on top of each other circles, those are osteons making up that compact bone. And as I keep saying, this is a hard outer bone, which tells you right away that compact bone is what gives your bone, your skeleton, protection and strength. Okay, so its function for compact bone, circle star, highlight compact bones, write that it is hard bone for protection and strength to your skeleton. Whereas the center portion of it, the medullary cavity that it's protecting, is marrow in the center of it, and that's the middle space of the bone where you have red and yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow being what we mentioned already makes your red blood cells, and yellow bone marrow being adipose. And adipose is a fancy way of saying fat. Okay, so you got red blood cells and fat in that medullary cavity. At the ends of the bones, you then have spongy bones. And spongy bones are a lot of times called cancellous bones, which is a weird word. I've always thought it was weird. And spongy bones, kind of like sponge suggests, are lighter and softer, and they're quite a bit weaker than the compact bone. Okay, so with the spongy bones, they're made up of something different. So instead of being made up of those osteons, those concentric circles of compact bone, instead, the spongy bone looks kind of like you would find in coral reefs or sponges. It has a lighter, softer texture to it, and it's made of what's called trabeculae. So these rod-shaped, these small rod-like structures are the trabeculae, and they are basically for support, okay? When you look at it, you notice it's basically a whole bunch of bars and plates separated by these weird gaps and spaces, okay? No defined shape the way the compact bone has. And then those spaces are actually filled with red bone marrow, which will be responsible for red blood cells, but also white blood cells and platelets as well. So compact bone, hard protective bone. Spongy bone is the softer, weaker trabeculae formed bone that is for support mainly and for bone marrow. This slide here is just to remind you that when you think of the human skeleton, please remember that adult humans have 206 bones. Now, when you picture your skeleton, I first want to mention the axial skeleton. So when we say axial skeleton, please note that that includes the skull, the thoracic cage, the sacrum, and the coccyx. Okay, and we consider it the midline of your body because you can kind of take your hand and just middle of your body, you have your skull, you have your cervical region, so that's your neck region, you have your thoracic, and then sacrum and coccyx. Okay, what each of these are, so first up you have your skull. That is made up of your cranium and your facial bones, and a lot of times you'll notice it's actually named after the lobes of your brain. So for instance, you have frontal bone, just like you have your frontal lobe of the brain. You have parietal bone in these skull pictures, just like you have parietal lobe of the brain. Okay, so they're bones that are named after the lobe of the brain that they are protecting, basically. And it includes a foramen magnum. And what your foramen magnum is a large opening at the base of your skull. And think about it. Why do you want this large opening at the base of your skull? Well, that's where your spine goes, right? So the foramen magnum is a large opening so that the spine can connect to the brain. You then have your vertebral column, which supports your head and your trunk, and it protects your spinal cord and the roots of your spinal nerves. It's broken up into parts called cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx, which you can see all over here where each of those locations are. And I want to point out, when you think of your thoracic cage, that is your 12 pairs of ribs, which I mentioned earlier, has the function of protecting your heart and your lungs, and that assists you in breathing as well. You then have your sacrum, which is all the way down here, and your sacrum is basically an anchor point where your spine will attach to your pelvis, and that helps provide stability for your body's core. And right attached to that, you have your coccyx, and most of you have probably accidentally hit your coccyx before. It's not a fun feeling. That is your tailbone, right? You usually hear it called your tailbone, and that tailbone is actually important because it's an attachment site for tendons, ligaments, and muscles that help you with your movement. In addition to that axial skeleton, I want you to know that the other form of your skeleton is your appendicular skeleton. Okay, so you have the axial middle line of your skeleton, and then you have the appendicular skeleton, which is for your appendages, and it includes the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, and the attached limbs. So your pectoral girdle, the purpose of that part of the appendicular skeleton is to support your arms and hands because, again, your pecs are up there where your arms and hands are in your chest region. Your pelvic girdle, think of your pelvis, that's supporting your legs and your feet, so your lower extremities. And then the attached limbs themselves are part of your appendicular skeleton. So that means your arms and legs. So please make sure you know what the difference between axial versus appendicular. Which parts of the skeleton are considered axial, which are considered appendicular. And again, appendicular, think appendages. That will help you figure out that it's related to your arms and legs and where they get attached to your body. In addition to all those bones, those 206 bones, you also have your joints. And joints are the area where two bones are basically attached, and it has the purpose of permitting your body parts to move. And you have three main types of joints. You have fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. And then you have the ligaments helping to join things together. So first up, you have your fibrous joints. They're fibrous because there is no cavity or space between the bones where you have these fibrous joints. And that means that without any space or cavity between them, fibrous joints do not move. Okay, so we call them immovable joints. An example of that would be between your cranial bones. Okay, so your big skull is made up of different bones. Remember we said you have frontal, parietal, all those different parts of your skull. Well, the joints between them, they don't move, right? You can't move parts of your skull. You can't, for instance, just open the flap of the frontal bone, okay? So cranial bones are an example of fibrous joints that are between the two bones but do not move. You then have cartilaginous joints, and just like cartilage suggests in the name, these are the joints in which the bones are connected by cartilage. Now, when you hear cartilage, that means you have slight movability to these joints, okay? These are the joints that you would find between your vertebrae along your spine. The last example is, I consider, the most important, even though I'm pretty sure the joints and bones of your brain are important too, around your brain, I mean. But to me, I think synovial joints are the ones to circle, star, highlight, because these are the freely movable joints. These are the big bulk of joints around your body. There are 6 types, which you can see various types listed out over here, okay? You have planar, hinge, pivot, condyloid, saddle, and ball and joint sockets. Okay, so again, that's all of these guys around here. All of these in the picture are synovial joints. When you hear synovial, keep in mind these are the only joints that have a nice cavity between the adjoining bones and that have fluid in that cavity. Now, once you hear that there is fluid, which we call synovial fluid, that means that there is now lubrication between these joints. So synovial joints with synovial fluid have lubrication. The fluid can reduce the friction between the bones, and it helps with greater movement. So any synovial joints are going to be the most movable of your joints. And the synovial fluid, just like we mentioned earlier about any fluid, it helps protect the cartilage and the bone, and it absorbs some shock, okay? Again, keep in mind synovial joints. When you hear that term, I want you to think these are the joints with the greatest movement of all the 3 types of joints, but also keep in mind more movement of the joint means it's going to be weaker. So you have to be careful with your synovial joints, and that includes your knees, your elbows, and your shoulders, okay? Knees, elbows, and shoulders are the examples here of synovial joints, and they're significant because of movement, the ability to move, and that synovial fluid is significant because it provides lubrication, protection, shock absorption, and greater movement. The last point that we make on this slide are the ligaments, and the ligaments are connective tissues that bind the bones together at the joint. Okay, so they're connective tissue keeping those bones together. And when we talk about your skeleton and bones, I want to point out that as you age, problems always arise with age, and one of the big problems is osteoporosis. And osteoporosis literally means porous bones, and you see porous bones right here in the bone matrix of osteoporosis bones. Basically, what this means is with osteoporosis, your bone mass decreases over time. And with bone mass decreasing, that means that the bone strength decreases as well. So you get weaker, more fragile bones, and even a minor stress at that point, such as coughing too hard, can actually cause fractures in those weak, fragile bones. Now, the good thing is bone mass and strength are maintained by things such as calcium and vitamin D. So anything related to calcium and vitamin D can help increase your chances of osteoporosis, okay, in terms of kind of reducing how quickly you will get it. A lot of people, eventually get it, but it will help hold it off. So things like exercise, getting sunlight to help build up vitamin D, drinking milk, which helps increase calcium and vitamin D, all of those things will help stave off or slow down the chances of osteoporosis. Now, in addition to bones in your skeletal system, you also have a whole bunch of muscles helping you with movement. You have your skeletal muscles, which basically maintain your posture, they provide support, and they allow for movement. Okay, so I know a lot of people, when they hear skeletal muscles, they think just movement, but it's also maintaining posture and providing support. And the reason why they then also allow for movement is because it's movement by pulling on bones. Okay, keep in mind, muscles never push bones. So when I say how do skeletal muscles work, they pull on your bones to move those bones. They never push bones. When it comes to your muscles, you'll also see the terms tone and tetany. Okay, I want you to know the difference. Tone of skeletal muscles means the fibers at rest, but these muscles still contract. So some fibers are considered at-rest muscles that still look as if they are contracting, okay? Whereas tetany or tetanus is the sustained contraction, maximum sustained contraction, okay? So you notice, for instance, if you've been working out plenty, say the person looks toned, but notice that they're not flexing or anything at that time. They look toned when their muscles are at rest because there's still some contraction, whereas tetany or tetanus is maximum sustained contraction. And you might have also heard of tetanus in relation to the infection, and you end up with tetanic paralysis, which means the muscles stay contracted and you see the person just looks completely stiff because all of their muscles are stuck contracting, and it ends up causing death through the paralysis of respiratory and cardiovascular systems. So basically you stop breathing and your heart stops pumping. Now, when we talk about skeletal muscles, notice that I say they work in antagonistic pairs, and we've mentioned the word antagonistic before. Antagonistic tells you opposites, right? They're working against each other. So in terms of muscles, antagonistic pairs means that as one muscle flexes, its paired muscle extends, and that allows for the movement. As one muscle flexes, its paired muscle extends. Okay, so make sure you understand the terminology that you hear in relation to skeletal muscles. Now you have a whole lot of skeletal muscles. This picture is just to show you the various different muscles, and I'm sure some of them you have heard of, especially if you're into working out. So pectoralis major, deltoids, biceps, triceps, all those terms, gluteus maximus, all of that stuff I'm sure you have heard before. You don't have to memorize any of these muscles. I just wanted you to see the various types of skeletal muscles that you have across your body. Now, in addition to those big muscles that you like to think about, I also want you to know the microscopic components of these skeletal muscles. So know what we mean by each of these terms. When you hear sarcolemma, that is a fancy way of saying the plasma membrane of skeletal muscles. Okay, so sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of skeletal muscles. And then sarcoplasmic reticulum, what does that sound like? Where have you heard reticulum before? Endoplasmic reticulum, right? So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is simply the modified endoplasmic reticulum of skeletal muscle. You then also have myofibrils. Okay, this is new to skeletal muscles, not parts of terminology that we've talked about before. And the myofibrils, they are the contractile structures in your sarcoplasm, in your muscle cells. Okay, so myofibrils are contractile structures that help with the movement of skeletal muscles. The last term here are the sarcomeres, and you see sarcomeres mapped out here, as the alternating Z disc and H zone Z disc segments of the skeletal muscles. Your sarcomeres are important because they are the units of contraction, meaning they are composed of myosin and actin, which you're going to see in the upcoming slides is what's responsible for the actual movement of your muscles. And this movement of those sarcomeres, of that myosin and actin, is performed in what we call the sliding filament model. And, if you look this up in a textbook or in a video, they will go into crazy details. But again, for general bio, that's not significant. What I want you to know is the general idea. The fact that your muscles contract by the sliding filament model, which basically looks like oars of a boat, helping the boat row, helping you move the boat. So picture that with myosin being the oars. So I'm trying to find the picture here. Yeah, so myosin being the oars and actin being the water that you are pushing into to slide across. Now, this sliding filament model is basically the idea of sarcomeres shortening, okay, and then becoming relaxed after that. And again, sarcomeres are the unit of contraction, which you saw in the other slide, that alternating ZHZ band, okay? Now with the sarcomere shortening, basically what happens is you have actin filaments sliding past the myosin filaments, because again, think of the actin as the water swishing past your boat, and that allows the myosin and the actin to now approach one another. What then happens, which if you kind of look at the cycles on this page, what happens is calcium influxes, meaning it flows into that skeletal muscle and it triggers actin to be exposed. Once actin is exposed, then the myosin becomes, again, the myosin being the oar of the boat, becomes energized by ATP and it cross bridges with actin, meaning you get the touching of the myosin to the actin. It's binding to that actin. With that cross bridging, then you end up with a release of ADP and phosphates, and you know that as the release of energy. That causes a power stroke, meaning just like an oar with the water, you now have this stroke of the myosin, so the myosin oar, stroking to pull or slide that actin, to slide itself forward. Myosin then detaches and cross-links to the next segment. So picture if you're rowing a boat, the oar comes in contact with the water, you have that power stroke, and then the oar comes out of the water, right? It detaches from the water the way myosin detaches from the actin. And then what do? You stroke again. You once again cross-link or bind to that water and power stroke. And you keep doing that to get the alternating strokes in rowing a boat, but it's the same thing with the strokes of myosin, actin, that movement of the muscle. And then at the end, calcium is eventually pumped out and you stop having that contraction of the muscle. Now, when you hear that calcium is involved, basically remember calcium is not only important for your bones, but also for your muscle movement. It's the calcium influx, meaning the calcium entering that muscle, that exposes the myosin binding sites on the actin, allowing the myosin to touch the actin and eventually slide it. Okay, so just keep in mind calcium is necessary for movement of muscles, and the movement is thanks to myosin cross-linking and sliding the actin. And when I say cross-linking, that simply means binding to and then releasing. So it binds and then releases, okay? So whenever you hear calcium, actin, myosin, think of the movement of muscles. Now, as we mentioned in there, in that previous slide, muscle contraction, that myosin actin sliding filament, it requires ATP, right? Because a lot of things in your body and your cells require ATP, require energy. Now the problem is cellular respiration does not supply enough quick ATP for your muscles to properly move and to function. So muscles end up relying on what's called creatine phosphate. So for spelling, it's right here, creatine phosphate. And what do you notice? Creatine phosphate, kind of like ATP, has a good old phosphate group that the cell can break off, and that can become energy. That can be used for energy, okay? And creatine phosphate can basically transfer that phosphate to ADP, and when you add phosphate to ADP, what does that create? ATP, because ADP is simply diphosphate, 2 phosphates, whereas our big energy group is 3 triphosphates. So creatine phosphate has a phosphate group that the muscle can break off, put with ADP to then use now as ATP, as energy. Now, if there is not enough oxygen, then the muscle can temporarily rely on fermentation, which we talked about in the cellular respiration chapter. But if you remember fermentation, there was the problem that it gives the byproduct of lactic acid, okay? So you end up having this, this waste product that your body needs to break down and get rid of. In order to break down and get rid of, now it's going to need extra oxygen that it didn't even have. So now there's oxygen debt. And that's basically how you end up having deep breathing. You're out of breath after exercise. Now, creatine in this process helping to provide the phosphate for energy with the muscle movement, you find creatine not only in supplements, but in a lot of the food products that have muscle meat. So as you can kind of see here, things like a big chunk of red meat will have high creatine, which will help you with your working out, with providing energy for that workout. But please be careful, because too much of a good thing is a problem. And so too much creatine ends up being bad for your kidneys. It puts a strain on your kidneys, and it can also cause stomach upset as well. So basically, remember everything in moderation. So be careful if you are into using creatine supplements or any of that kind of stuff with your workouts. The last thing that I want to mention about your skeletal muscular system is that it requires what's called neuromuscular junctions. And these neuromuscular junctions are basically the synaptic contact between a nerve fiber and a muscle fiber, hence neuromuscular. So it's nerve fiber and muscle fiber. And as you know, synaptic contact, that means when you have that close contact of, for instance, the axons. So basically what happens at neuromuscular junctions is that nerve impulses will trigger the release of neurotransmitters, which we mentioned in the nervous system. And those neurotransmitters, which you see represented here as those different colored speckles, okay, they basically will cross the synaptic cleft. Okay, so nerve impulses, this being the nerve, the axon end, those neurotransmitters, the green speckles there, they merge with the membrane of the axon and they are spit out into the synaptic junction. But this time, instead of the synapse being one neuron and the next neuron, it's one neuron and now the muscle, right? The muscle fiber over here. And when that neuron releases those neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, that gap between the neuron's axon terminal and the muscle cell's sarcolemma, again, sarcolemma being the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. So the neurotransmitters cross that gap, that cleft, and ultimately they signal this muscle fiber to contract. Then the neurotransmitters must be removed from the cleft because you don't want that muscle to continuously stay contracted. What would that be called? Tetanus, right? You don't want tetanus for long term. And so the way that your body then gets rid of those neurotransmitters are things such as acetylcholine esterase, which breaks down acetylcholine, and there'll be ones for the different neurotransmitters as well. But the one focused in this image here is acetylcholine esterase. Okay, to then break down that acetylcholine once the muscle fiber has fired or contracted. Okay, so again, neuromuscular junction means where you have a nerve fiber meeting a muscle fiber. You get the nerve fiber's axon releasing the neurotransmitters into that synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters then signal the muscle fiber to contract, but they must then be removed or broken down, those neurotransmitters, so that the muscle doesn't stay contracting. Okay? That is it for skeletal muscular system. So if you have any questions, as always, send me a message and remind. I don't mind helping you out or giving you some practice problems. Okay? As always, have a wonderful day and thank you.